Despite the recent change in testing methods, sadly our statistics are showing that our efforts have not yet yielded the number of test subjects initial hypotheticals had projected. But Anne has assured me that perseverance is the path to success. And so here we are. Testing, for the time being, will continue as planned. Today's story is from a tour guide of an old copper mine and his experience in the mine while trespassing after hours. The account goes like this. My name is Emmanuel Williams, but everyone just calls me Manny. I was born up near Hancock into, honestly, a really religious family, so I hope news doesn't make it back to them that I made a statement here. The studying and cataloging of so-called supernatural events really isn't something that's embraced or even understood in the kind of home I grew up in. But I know what happened wasn't natural. It couldn't have been. I would have been fine never telling anyone what really happened. But the other day I was thinking to myself that there was no way I could be so special, for lack of a better word. To be the only one ever to experience something like this, it didn't make sense. And so I figured at the very least it wouldn't hurt for it to be on record somewhere, just in case. So that's why I'm here. This happened to me in June of 2007. A good friend of mine, my best friend, actually, Gabriel Lewis, had recently landed me a job at Quincy Mine up in the UP. It's an old deep shaft copper mine that opened in the mid-1800s, and by the time it closed in 1945, it was the deepest mine in the world, just passing 6,000 feet deep. Nowadays, it's mainly used as a tourist attraction. Gabe had been working there about 2 years and assured me that the job was cake. We'd spent so many summers of our youth exploring all sorts of caves and old mines around the UP, and the experience gained from that, along with being young and charismatic, was what eventually landed me the job. Our primary duty was to inform, entertain, and guide small groups of people down into certain sections of the mine. All sorts of people would show up during the busy season. Some people even traveled from around the world, but mostly it was families with young children making an unplanned stop along their road trip. We'd take our time leading them through different parts of the mine that were still safe, spouting out our boring pre-scripted historical facts about the town and the mine, before eventually leading them back to the surface and afterwards, of course, directing them towards the gift shop. I liked the job, and for the most part, it was going really well. That is, until a few months into work. Gabe had the bright idea that we should head down into the mine to explore some of the deeper off-limit areas, referencing how it would be just like old times, and of course, I agreed. He told me he'd fill me in on the details after work. Now, the very deepest areas of the mine are long flooded by groundwater, and many of the other passages on the lower levels were completely collapsed, or soon to be so. I mentioned this to Gabe, and he assured me that we wouldn't be heading into anywhere dangerous. Said he knew of a few spots near the middle of the main shaft that people hadn't been inside for years. Except for himself, of course. To be honest, he didn't really have to try hard to convince me. Security on the site was extremely lax. Basically non-existent, to be honest. Hancock is a very sleepy town, and even when the tourists show up in the summer, they don't show up in droves. So keeping the site secure really isn't an issue if no one is trespassing to begin with. Plus, we worked there and could most likely spin some sort of cover story if someone did call the cops. There was technically several mines on the site, but shaft number 2 was the largest by far. Everything about its construction was unheard of at the time. Over the top of the mine sat the hoist house. When it was built, it housed the largest steam engine mine hoist ever built, and that sat on top of the largest slab of cement ever poured. The steam engine powered a large metal sled used to transport workers and copper ore into and out of the mine's depths. The shaft wasn't straight down. It traveled down at a 55-degree angle, with multiple floors along the way to... I'm sorry. Some of the facts we had to tell people are still ingrained into my mind. Me and Gabe met sometime after midnight in a nearby parking lot and snuck through a small area of woods until we reached the site. No residential homes were anywhere close by, and there were no nightly security guards to be seen, so we had the site all to ourselves. Gabe had the keys, and we made our way over to the hoist house while he filled me in on where he planned for us to explore. The deepest any of the tours ever went were down to level 7, but Gabe had plans to head down deeper to level 10. Operating the sled was extremely simple, the idea being that any miner could be taught to use it without any problems. It was basically one lever, and whichever way you pushed it determined the direction the sled moved, and how hard you pushed it in that direction controlled the speed. Like I said, simple. In its heyday, the sled could haul about 10 tons of ore while reaching speeds as high as 35 miles an hour, which was extremely impressive for the time. In its current state, it can't quite reach those speeds, but it was built to last and still functions about as well as it did back then. We checked over our shoulders one last time, then headed inside the building and locked the door behind us. We took a minute to slip on our climbing gear and hard hats equipped with headlamps, climbed into the sled, and slowly began heading down. Now, for the most part, Gabe knew where he was going in the mine, but he hadn't actually explored too deep into the adjacent tunnels himself, so we didn't know what obstacles we might come across. The main part of the mine that tourists use had electric lights strung up. The area we were heading did not. It didn't matter what time of day it was outside. In the mines, without any light source, it was absolutely pitch black. When we got down to the 10th level, Gabe told me to shut off my light for a second, and suddenly we were plunged into a black, empty void. It felt like I was floating in some deep section of outer space, devoid of stars. And it actually gave me a bit of vertigo, like I could just simply fall forward into it forever. Suddenly, the darkness was shattered when Gabe turned on his handheld flashlight and pointed it up under his chin, making a ghost wailing noise. I humored him back with a laugh and a quick punch on the arm before we turned our headlamps back on and set off into the mine. I hadn't fully realized just how large and intricate the mine was. Miles and miles of tunnels fractured out from the main shaft, snaking away deep into the earth. Everything had been left exactly where it was, seemingly untouched for the last 100 years. Old pickaxes and broken cap lamps, decrepit machinery next to rusted cart tracks nearly covered by the dirt. No one ever needed to come down here for repairs, and the land was privately owned, so as far as we knew, we were the first humans to see these things since they'd been abandoned. I wondered for a moment why the miners would have left all this stuff behind. It looked to me like everything had just been dropped, seemingly right in the middle of a workday. I tried not to think about it too hard. We must have spent hours down there, taking small keepsakes of anything interesting we could find and snapping some grainy photos on our cell phones. We'd been heading down a particular pathway that seemed to lead deeper than the other ones. Pretty soon we realized the deeper we got, the wetter it got. We figured we must be approaching some of the levels that had flooded. The walls seemed to get smoother, and the passageways tightened around us, until we had to walk single file, at some points the walls nearly brushing against our shoulders. We were nearing what Gabe had marked on the map as the so-called halfway point, the deepest point on our descent where we planned to take a small rest before we could turn around and head back up. Thinking about how deep we were into the earth, so far away from everything on the surface, was the first time it hit me what we were actually doing. Not only were we technically breaking the law, and at serious risk of losing our jobs, but if something went wrong down here, we would have no possibility of contacting outside help. Cell phones were obviously useless down here, and even if we'd brought a two-way radio, the signal wouldn't make it through the thousands of feet of earth and stone. But like I said, we'd both had plenty of experience in caves and mines just like this. We had a small amount of food and water, a first aid kit and extra batteries, so if anything were to go wrong, we were at least prepared for it. We had no idea just how wrong things could possibly go. Gabe was always the bravest of us two. I think I looked up to him in some ways. He was always the one in the lead, the one who would plan our adventures, and whenever even there was a small chance of danger, Gabe would run towards it while everyone else ran away. That's just who he was. When we reached our halfway point, at the deepest point of our journey, the tight tunnels opened up into a huge cathedral-like room. It was so big and so dark we couldn't see the other side. Our flashlights reflected off a few shallow puddles dotting the muddy ground, creating a mesmerizing and unsettling light show that danced and moved against the smooth, moist walls. That was when everything went wrong. Just as I was about to turn and say something to Gabe, we suddenly heard a loud but eerily polite knocking on what sounded like a wooden door. It echoed throughout the chamber for an unnecessary amount of time. We both stood absolutely still. Gabe was wide-eyed. His gaze was fixed on the area the noise had come from, scanning it for signs of movement, even though it was too dark to see that far. It seemed that the sound came from the far side of the cavern, too distant to be seen by the beams of our cheap headlamps. His head didn't move, but his eyes shot me a glance, and I knew he wanted to investigate. I had a really, really bad feeling all of a sudden, and violently shook my head no. We stood frozen for a moment. The quiet itself was deafening, only broken by the sound of my rapid heartbeat, and I realized I was holding my breath. I slowly exhaled and whispered quietly to Gabe, asking him if anyone else would be down here and who would be knocking on doors. He barely shook his head, still focusing on the dark before us. "There shouldn't be any doors down here," he said, and began slowly and quietly walking in the direction the sound had come from. I immediately grabbed his arm and told him we were leaving. He didn't answer or acknowledge me, though. He just shook me off and slowly kept moving forward. I sighed, not wanting to leave him, and so I followed behind him slowly. We inched forward, aiming our lights ahead, trying to see the other side of the cavernous room. Even though I was on the verge of freaking out, I couldn't take my mind off how unnaturally smooth the walls were here. A light gray color, slick with moisture and glistening in the harsh light of our headlamps. We reached what seemed to be the middle of the huge room. As we looked forward, the opposite side of the chamber slowly began to illuminate, and our light beam settled on a lone wooden door. It was intricately carved, and while it looked slightly weathered, it wasn't rotten and warped like it should have been if it had been down here for a long time. It wasn't attached to anything. It just stood eerily near the back wall of the chamber. We waited for another knock, staring at it silently for what felt like forever, but it never came. Gabe gave me a look. I could tell he was just as confused as I was, and he started walking towards the door. I don't know why I didn't try and stop him. Maybe I was too scared. Everywhere else we'd been in the mine felt stagnant and old, but in here the air felt almost electric. There was a feeling of anticipation, as if a great tree were falling, and a crowd of onlookers stood watching in those quiet moments before it crashed into the earth. It felt like an eternity for him to reach the door. He slowly, shakingly reached out with one hand and gripped the brass handle. And when he opened it, there was nothing. It led to nothing. Just an open view of the slick gray wall behind it. Of course it did, I said to myself. I don't know what we were expecting. We looked at each other, both letting out a quiet laugh at our paranoia, and I'm sure we both felt slightly embarrassed. Gabe was about 20 feet away from me when he turned and began walking back. And it was then that I spotted something move slightly when the light from his headlamp briefly illuminated a section of wall behind the door. It almost looked as if part of the wall itself had moved, or squirmed. I called out to him, "Hey, what was that?" He could see my wide eyes facing past him, and he whipped around. And what his headlamp fell upon still haunts my nightmares. Starting at the knees and slowly angling up, Gabe's headlamp illuminated an extremely tall, slender, and sickly-looking thing coming away from the wall where it had been pressed tightly up against. Its skin was gray and slick with moisture, stretched like leather over sickly, skinny, and odd-shaped limbs. Its unnaturally tall body reached almost all the way to the tall ceiling. Its limbs, were bending and unfurling like the thing had been tightly contorted and bent into the area that it was pressed against the wall. Its head was almost featureless, smooth and hairless. I could barely make out 2 small holes on either side, which I assumed were its ears. Its face only contained 2 small beady eyes that reflected bright eyeshine when hit by our headlamps, and a wide, gaping mouth hung open, drooling a viscous, inky black saliva that sizzled and smoked when it dripped into the muddy earth beneath it. In that moment, it felt like time was frozen. And then, everything happened so fast. Gabe turned on his heels and tried to run. I started to run towards him. I didn't know what I was going to do. Help him somehow? I don't know. But I froze when I saw the towering creature begin to move after him. The thing itself didn't move particularly fast, but because of its long stride, it only took 1 or 2 steps to reach him. It reached down, easily catching Gabe from behind, pressing its palm onto the back of his head with its huge bony hand, wrapping its fingers around his face as it tightened its grip. It lifted him easily backwards into the air, his legs flailing and frantically kicking around. I wanted to help. I wanted to save my friend. But my eyes suddenly shifted to the walls around us, and I quickly realized what we had stumbled into. This was a nest. All of the walls around us began to wriggle and squirm. Gabe was screaming, I know that, but I could barely hear him over the panicked beating of my heart as I seen more and more of these things pull themselves away from the jagged stone beneath. The walls of this chamber were never smooth. It was just lined floor to ceiling with what could have been hundreds of these things. The final moment that I saw Gabe, there were dozens of them closing in around him, reaching out and grabbing onto his body everywhere their hands would fit, lifting him high into the air, pulling on his limbs in all different directions. He was looking directly into my eyes, screaming like I'd never heard a human do, crying and pleading with me to help him, to save him. But when I heard movement behind me, I broke from my trance. I turned, and I started to run. His guttural screams echoed through the tunnels behind me, until his hysterical cries were abruptly silenced and replaced suddenly by the sound of a sick, tearing rip, followed by the sound of wet snapping and breaking. A few times I thought I heard something behind me, a fast, scuttering series of what sounded like wet, heavy footsteps closing in, but I did not look. I ran faster, back through the mines, back past all the decrepit machines and cart tracks. At some point, I had begun crying, but I couldn't be sure when. It felt like I was running forever. I started to get worried that I had taken a wrong turn, and I began to think that I would end up just like Gabe. But finally, I rounded the last corner and spotted the metal sled. I dove over the guardrail into the sled and slammed the lever up, causing it to suddenly lurch up the ramp and out of the darkness. I did not want to look, but an image entered my mind of those things bounding and clambering up the ramp behind me. They weren't, luckily. But as I turned my head, I saw just for a moment the light from my headlamp briefly illuminating dozens of pairs of sickly yellow eyes shining back at me from where I'd just been. All of the eyes were frozen in place, unblinking, just eerily watching me escape. And soon the eyeshine dwindled until I was far enough away that I couldn't see them anymore. When I reached the top, I burst out into the cool night air, locking the door behind me and barricading it, and physically breathing a sigh of relief. I made my way back to Gabe's car. That's when I finally fell to my knees and started to cry. I cried for quite a while before finally wiping my eyes and taking a solemn moment of silence for my friend. I went to the police, of course. I decided not to mention those things or what exactly happened to Gabe. I just made up some bullshit story on how we'd gotten separated in the mine and that I'd heard him scream, but I could never find where he was. The investigators that scoured that mine never found a trace of Gabe. I knew they wouldn't. Whatever those things were down there, they were all painfully thin. I wondered how it was they could even survive down there, how they could reproduce. It doesn't make sense naturally. So that's why I came to you. That's it, really. I have nightmares still. Almost every night. I often wake up screaming, soaking head to toe in a puddle of my own sweat. The last thing I hear before I wake up is Gabe begging me to come back, to save him, before that awful tearing noise jolts me awake. One of the things that still makes my stomach turn is the image I saw just before I ran. The way those things were surrounding him, mouths open and drooling, I can't help but think of a family. A large family surrounding a meal at dinner time. Everyone's hands reaching in, trying to get a piece.